Tracy Hames comes from the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. He's here to talk to us about the Bad River Watershed and its impact on habitat, the importance of watersheds, and the proposed mine that is going to be, they're talking about up in the Penokee Mountains. So Tracy got his master's degree from here, UWST, many years ago, a few years ago?
Many?
A few years ago.
The 80s weren't that long ago.
So I'd like to introduce you tonight, Tracy Hames. Thank you.
Scott, can we dim the lights back there? You know how to work that? Is that too dark?
Oh, that's good.
Maybe a little lighter? All right. I want to be able to see the audience if anybody nods off. I've got a laser pointer, I know how to wake you up. Well, thank you for having me out here tonight. I'm really happy to be here. It's always great coming back to Stevens Point. I lived here, it was about 85 through 89 for a few years doing my master's work at the University of Wildlife. I studied the stretch of the river here, the Stevens Point flowage. So I spent 2 summers every day out in canoe out paddling around those beautiful waterways there. So good to be back. Tonight we're going to talk about the wetlands of the Bad River Watershed, Penokee Hills, and if you're ready, we'll dive right in. Now, first off, our association, Wisconsin Wetlands Association, I'm the executive director there. We are a science-based membership organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan. A lot of the work we do is helping local governments understand how to protect and care for the wetlands in their areas. We promote wetlands as solutions to local planning. When you have flood problems, sometimes the answer is wetland protection and restoration. We're working a lot now with private land stewardship, helping private landowners care for their wetlands. 75% of Wisconsin's wetlands are on private land, so that's a real important group of folks to be working with. And we're promoting the best science and management. We're a bunch of science geeks, and that's a big part of what we do is work with science. So what are we doing up in the Penokees? We're a small organization statewide. We work throughout Wisconsin. We're located in Madison, our offices. And so when we get involved in issues like this, we have to go through a kind of a series of triage questions to make sure, do we have the capacity, do we have the ability to get involved in something like this? So if we got involved in every little issue around the state, we wouldn't be able to sleep. So we look at these criteria, and this issue really hit them all. It's a precedent-setting issue with statewide implications, watershed scale effects, as we'll talk about tonight. One of the highest quality watersheds in the Midwest. At the bottom of this watershed is a place called the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs. We'll talk about that. And the fact that there's really a need for science-driven decision-making on this project. We're trying to move away from the discussion based on money and politics and things like that, and get people to understand what's up there and what the implications are from that standpoint. And we like to get in the middle of local, tribal, state, federal, help folks communicate, especially about the science, and coordinate. So that's why we're up there. What are we doing up there? And by the way, all these photos that you see tonight are taken of wetlands up in the Penokee Hills at the site of the proposed iron mine. We're identifying the wetland and watershed issues. We're advocating for the best science and environmental reviews. That doesn't always happen, so we're making sure, really kind of a watchdog to make sure the science is done right and the right questions are asked and the right data is collected. Helping decision makers understand the wetland and watershed issues. We're the wetland people, so that's our message is why are these wetlands important, and we'll talk about that tonight. And protecting the sloughs and promoting public involvement. So tonight we'll talk about what's being proposed, the mine project, what's up there on the site, the wetlands and watershed resources in the area, and then talk about watershed processes and what happens then if you remove the wetlands, what happens to the rest of the watershed. So I always like to show this when I go. I've been giving this talk all around the state, and it's amazing. A lot of people have heard about this proposed iron mine, but they don't know where it is. Well, there it is right there, the red dot. way up north in Iron County, near the, not too far from Pearlie or the town of Mellon, if anybody knows where Mellon is. It's about 300 miles from this place right here where our office is, one way, so a lot of miles on the vehicle here in the last couple of years. Well, I'd like to start with a picture of the Bad River Watershed. So let's take a look at what we've got. So right here is what they call the Penokee Hills. This red line is the iron ore body, where the iron is. This is Lake Superior, of course. Ashland, city of Ashland is about right here. The Bad River Watershed flows north into Lake Superior, so it's a Lake Superior watershed. There's a couple of ridges right here, and on the top of the watershed here, the white is the proposed mine location right here. The watershed kind of flows south for a little bit at first, and then takes a U-turn and goes straight north, and all ends up in the river. This is a place called the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The Bad River is right here. It has several tributaries flowing into it, but it all comes in to the Kakagon Sloughs. Now, a couple important features to understand. This line right here is the Bad River Reservation, the Bad River Tribe, okay? And this area here is the top of the ridge. This is where they want to dig the hole. It's going to be an open pit mine that's being proposed as an open pit mine. And an important thing to remember is this location right here is at about 1,800 foot elevation, 1,800 feet. Okay, by the time you get to the bottom of the watershed, Lake Superior is at about 600 foot elevation. So you've got a drop from the top to the bottom of about 1,200 feet. For Wisconsin, that's a fairly steep watershed. So remember that, because that's important for later. Okay, so the iron up in this area, in this portion of Wisconsin, is, it's ancient. It was laid down over 1 billion years ago, and over time things happened, and the ore body here has been folded. So instead of laying flat like the iron bodies in Minnesota, this one's tilted, and here you can see it's at about a 60-degree angle. So the iron body here, the rocks with the iron in it, is plunging down into the earth. So if you want to extract that, what do you got to do? You got to dig a real deep hole. So here's a picture of what we know of what they've said there. The company has said they are proposing to build. This is a aerial photo showing the outlines of their project area and what they want to do where, coming out of a plan, what they called their pre-project proposal, which came out a year ago September, so a little over a year ago. And that's really the most information that the company has provided for what it says it wants to do. So remember that red line? This is the top of the hill. This is the iron body, the Penokee Ridge. The plan is, according to what they've told us, is to dig a 4.5 mile wide open pit that's about a half mile wide, well, I guess 4.5 miles long, half mile wide pit to get at that plunging ore body, and it could be anywhere from 700 to 1,000 feet deep. Now, when you dig a hole that big and that deep, you can't just dig straight down. It's got to be at an angle or the whole thing will collapse on you. So you've got to dig a much bigger hole than the actual ore is itself. So when you do that and you pull all that rock out of the ground, not all of it's iron rock, not all of it's iron ore, so you have a lot of what you call waste rock associated with digging a hole that deep. So what do you do with all that extra rock that isn't iron? They're proposing then to put it right here. This is what they call the stockpile area, and an area here what they're calling topsoil. Remember that the watershed flows south at first, so this is 1,800 foot elevation, and the creeks flow south before they turn north and go up and out. So our work then has been really concentrating in this area right here, because this is some of the biggest impacts from a wetland standpoint of the project footprint. There are wetlands in the area where the pit is, but it's at the top of the hill. It's a fairly steep hill, so there's not as many wetlands as in here. This is a much flatter area. So a lot of the work we've been doing is in here. So you can see some acreage figures. The pit area is about 1,000 acres total, and the stockpile area, what they're proposing, is about 1,000 acres as well. When you calculate the the volume of the waste rock they'd have to pull out of this hole, it translates, if this was accurate, a pile of rock's about 500 foot high. So the ultimate effect of such a project then would be the destruction of all wetlands, of course, inside this area here.
Could you just orient me and let me know where Mellon is?
Mellon's this way. Yeah, not too far. Highway 77 is just off the photo a little bit, right up here. So, when we get involved in a project like this, I'm not one of these people that can sit in Madison and deal with an issue like this from an office in Madison. I gotta be on the landscape, I gotta be really familiar with what's going on up there. So we put on our boots, and you can see it's a lot of red clay out there, and headed north. And in 2013 and 2014, literally hundreds and hundreds of hours out in the field getting to know this landscape. So when we're talking about it, we're talking about things that we're very, very familiar with because we've been on the ground. So what's up there? Let's talk about the wetlands of the Bad River Watershed. Once again, all these pictures are taken from the project site. And most of the pictures of the wetlands you'll see are in the stockpile area. They'd be covered with 500 foot of rock if this proposal went as they planned. So I'd like to start out with this, the ephemeral wetlands. These are the wetlands that capture the snow melt and the spring rains. And these are some of the wetlands that are most least recognized even as wetlands. Because they're really wet in the spring, but by July, August, oftentimes they're just mud flats. Because what they do is they capture spring snow melted rain, hold that back, slow it down, and allow that water to soak into the ground, and it's gone by the heat of the summer. So a lot of these types of wetlands are up there. These are the workhorse wetlands of the watershed. We'll talk about processes in a few minutes. But the other important thing about ephemeral wetlands is because they're ephemeral, because they dry up, they're really important for wildlife. Well, why is that? If I'm a frog or a salamander, I want to lay my eggs here. Why? Because there's no fish in a wetland like this. So as soon as the snow starts to melt and there's open water in these wetlands, and I've been up there where there's just a little bit of open water, you can start to see egg masses in the water already. They're getting in there as quick as they can get in there. They're cranking their eggs out because they know that thing's going to dry up later, and they got to get their babies going before it dries. So really, really incredibly beautiful and diverse wetlands. Usually by fall they're dry. This is from 2013. It was a really wet year, and this is a just absolutely stunningly gorgeous, gorgeous wetlands, all dotted through this forested landscape. Of course, cedar swamps and black ash swamps, a lot of those up there, and they're just gorgeous. You go out into those places, and the ground is just lined with sphagnum moss. It's squishy. You walk out there, and it's even in the middle of the summer, and you lift up that sphagnum beneath, and you'll see standing water underneath that stuff. Absolutely beautiful, really diverse habitats, really unique plants in places like this. And when you're in these habitats, it's like you're in Middle Earth, like you're in J.R. Tolkien land. It's really neat. Of course, spruce bogs, a lot of spruce bogs up in here, and we'll talk about the effects of those, and especially around the outside edge of where they're proposing to put the waste rock. It's all lined with big old spruce bogs. Alder thickets. I love to show this picture because best way to experience an alder thicket is to get out into one. And this is what it looks like when you're out in an alder thicket. Guess what? They're thick. And these are really important wetlands, especially along the trout streams. Did I mention there's a lot of trout streams up here? High quality trout streams. And these are the wetlands alongside the trout streams, helping shade the water and capture some of the floodwaters. Good wildlife habitat as well. Wet meadows, a lot of wet meadows in here. These are stunningly gorgeous places. This is about a 200-acre wetland right at the base of the hill, right next to where they want to put the hole, dig the hole. And every time I'd go out into this wetland, there'd be different flowers in bloom. And this was taken from my, the iPhone camera. And I always wanted to get a good photographer up here, but you know, that's all I've got right now. But just gorgeous, gorgeous, really diverse habitats. Riparian Wetland, very important for the trout streams up in these areas. These are the areas right next to the creeks that help hold floodwaters and help protect the banks and keep the trout streams good for trout. Okay, so why is this stuff important? They're beautiful, they're neat, they got frogs in them, salamanders, who cares? Why should we care about these wetlands, besides just their beauty and their diversity, which, from my perspective, is reason enough, but why else should we care about these wetlands? So we'll talk about these things. You have to read all those words right now. Remember we said the top of the hill is at 1,800-foot elevation. That ridge kind of helps affect the weather, and any of you folks that are up in that area know how it snows. You get anywhere on average on this site from 60 to 200 inches on average per year. And the last couple of years have been a lot more than that. I think they got about a 3-foot snow just last week up in this site. Healthy forests up there. A lot of the stockpile area, I didn't mention this yet, but where they want to dump all the rock is on land owned by Iron County itself, managed for timber production and recreation. Okay, so this is some of the Iron County land. This photo was taken May 24th, 2013. That's 2 foot of snow out there. So the healthy forests slow down the snow melt. They keep the snow from melting really quickly. Okay? You remove those trees, the snow melts a lot faster. So we start out there in the spring, healthy forests slow the melt. All that melting snow then, remember, 200 inches or more, then has to go somewhere. Where does it go when it melts? It goes into the wetlands. Okay? And one of the things that really surprised us when we first started going up there, and once we got up there, it was a surprise at first, but then it made sense. When you have that much snow and that much spring precipitation in a landscape like this, you need to have a lot of wetlands to handle all that water. So since glacial times, the landscape has evolved to process that huge quantity of water that lands on this property in the winter. So you have incredibly abundant wetland resources there, capturing that water, slowing it down, holding it back so it doesn't go rushing down into these creeks and rivers. If you remove the wetlands, if you remove those trees and all that snow melted all at once, you would scour out your waterways. You'd have all kinds of effects. We'll talk about some of those effects here in a minute. Anyway, so the snow melts, it gets captured by these abundant wetlands. And some of them are very large quantities of water in the springtime. So what happens to that water? It goes into the wetlands. A big part of what happens then is that water starts soaking into the ground. When you look at a wetland and you see the open water, oftentimes that's maybe about a third of the water actually being held in that wetland. A lot of the water is in the ground itself. And remember, you're at 1,800-foot elevation. One thing you got to remember in watersheds is gravity. Gravity works. So that water starts working its way downstream in the ground. Also on the surface. Now this is a picture, and this was, I think, in early June, maybe mid-June 2013. And this is a channel flowing out of one of the wetlands into another wetland. When I see a channel like this, I get really excited. So why do I get excited for seeing a channel like this? Well, look at this channel. That channel there, going through the woods in between the wetlands, is about 18 inches wide and about 6 inches deep. So what? What that tells me when I see landscape features like this is that the wetlands are doing their part capturing that water. If the wetlands weren't there, if we didn't have all those wetlands holding that water, doing their job, you couldn't have channels like this on your landscape. This channel would be 4 foot wide by 3 foot deep because all that water would rush off at once, scouring out that waterway. The fact that you have these small channels on your landscape with that abundant water tells you something's working right up here. All that water then works its way downstream through the ground and through the small channels into the trout streams, downstream, and that water that's held back by those wetlands in the spring is really important for later on in the summer. So trout need cold water, clean cold water. So the rule is when you have snow melt and you put that water into the ground, cold water in, cold water out. The ground acts like a refrigerator. So that snow melts, it goes into the ground, it works its way out. Guess what? That same water that went into the ground in May is popping out in these trout streams in July and August, in the hot time of the year, as small little springs, providing good base flow, cool, clean water for the trout during the hot time of the year. Now, a lot of folks look at this picture here, this is Tyler Forks Creek, and they say, is something wrong with that water? It's brown. Why is that water brown? And really, that brown color is from the tannic acids developed by the bogs in the upper part of the watershed, the tamaracks. So when you, in that part of the state, when you see that color water, that's telling you there's healthy wetlands upstream. So that's a good color to see. It's not pollution, it's not dirt. Here's how it all works. Friction slows the flow. So this poor guy here, he got tossed out of the airplane, and he doesn't have his parachute. He's going to go down and hit really hard. Somebody mentioned to me sometimes this looks like a past president. And I didn't draw these pictures. Anyway, so he went down there. It's going to hurt really hard. It's the same with rivers and creeks. If you remove the wetlands act like the parachute. So you throw the guy out with the parachute, and he's going to go down fine. If you do that, if you remove the wetlands, if you flush all that water down your waterway all at once, you get unstable banks, you get braiding, you get all these bad things that hurt your rivers and creeks and hurt your trout. The wetlands then are like friction. They slow it down, they keep it healthy, they keep the water, the base flow flowing, all the things that the plants and animals need and the fish to survive. This is what it looks like. This is what a healthy side channel looks like. It's really rough. You got a lot of dead wood. In that dead wood is a lot of insect production. That's the stuff the trout are feeding on, etc. So that water is being held by those, slowed down by those trees and all that material soaking into the ground. That's what a really healthy upper watershed channel looks like. The other thing the wetlands do, an important function besides regulating the water, is the nutrients and carbon. So all that material that comes off of the trees and elsewhere falls into the wetlands, and right where the water meets the mud is where all the action happens. That's where the bugs are in there chewing everything up, processing all that organic and carbon, and slowly releasing that also then down the watershed. So you don't have big flushes of nutrients early on in the spring and then using them all up, and then you don't have nutrients later. It provides a good steady source of carbon and nutrients, so you can have healthy fish populations downstream all summer long. Of course, wetlands reduce flooding. Truth be told, this is not a picture from the Bad River Watershed. I have no idea where it is, but it illustrates the problems we have when we don't take care of our wetlands. This is a science talk, so I have to show a graph, the one obligatory graph, and this is a hydrograph. A hydrograph is a measure of the flow down a river, and this is actually back in my old job. I worked for a couple of decades out in eastern Washington State for an Indian tribe out there called the Yakima Nation. And this is the Yakima River, which is the east side of the Cascades river that the upper part of the watershed, just like the Penokees, is in the Cascade Mountains, and it flows down. So every now and then in the Pacific Northwest, when you have all that snow in the mountains in January, you can get what they call a pineapple express, a real wet system coming off of the Pacific Ocean, drop rain on top of all that snow, all that stuff comes rushing down the watershed all at once. So in this hydrograph, we've got an interesting situation. This is in the area where I worked. This is downstream a little bit about the mid part of the watershed, and there's two cities along the river there that are nearby, Parker and Grandview. Parker is situated about 30 miles upstream from the city of Grandview. In between them is 30 miles. Okay, so what happened when all this water came flushing down out of the mountains down the Yakima River? The blue line is the hydrograph at Parker. In 1 day's time, it went from about 2,000 cubic feet per second, that's a quantity of flow, from 2,000 to 33,000. See, that's in 1 day. And then it dropped just about as fast as that when all that water came flushing through, right? So they had probably real problems with flooding. Well, the same amount of water then, 30 miles down, passed through Grandview, right? Same quantity. Well, look at Grandview's hydrograph. It went same thing. It rose slower, and it only peaked at about 23,000 cubic feet per second, and then it dropped off a lot slower. Why? What's the difference in those two towns? in between Parker and Grandview was 30 miles of really healthy wetlands, side channels, and floodplains, capturing all that flow that rushed past Parker. It got slowed down, captured by the floodplains, held it back. By the time it went to Parker, we didn't have the high peaks that you had at Parker. Because upstream from Parker is a lot of river that's impacted by highways and things. You don't have a lot of wetlands between Parker and upstream. So there's a real strong illustration of the effect of wetlands on flood peaks. You lose your real flashiness when you have healthy wetlands and floodplains. Very important concept that we'll talk about later, why that's important. Wetlands also reduce erosion and capture sediment. This is outside of the Bad River Watershed as well, but it's nearby. This is up near Bayfield. These are two rivers. These photos were taken April 2013, 45 minutes apart. What's the difference? This here is the North Pikes Creek, has abundant healthy wetlands in its upper watershed. This is the Sandy River, it doesn't. So look at the difference. The sediment coming down through there, the scoured banks, the incision, the water's down. Here you have a much healthier situation than we have here. So the wetlands are capturing that sediment, keeping it from flushing down as much. Of course, wetlands provide diverse plant and animal life. Just absolutely gorgeous habitats up in the Penokee Hills. I've had so much fun the last couple summers just out getting lost in those wetlands and exploring the beautiful diversity. Native vegetative communities. I've had a lot of surprises when I first came up into the Bad River Watershed. The first surprise I had was when we first got up there, thinking that, oh my gosh, we're getting involved in this issue and I'm gonna have to go up there and find a really damaged watershed, a place that's really in bad condition. I was worried about that because a lot of the watersheds that flow into Lake Superior have been damaged in the past. All of them were clear cut, including this area in the late 1800s, and a lot of the watersheds west of this area, agriculture followed it up. So you have a lot of these places where the wetlands have been lost, and you have the effects of 100 years of no wetlands in your watershed, incised channels, these big canyonated things, really nasty looking stuff. I was expecting that up here. Boy, was I surprised. I never in 100 years would have imagined to find what we found up in this area here. So it had all been clear cut. It's been actively logged for the last 100 years continuously. This is a timber production area for the county, but it's been managed very well. This is not a pristine area. A lot of people call these hills pristine. They're absolutely not. This is a working landscape. This has had 100 years of active timber management and still is being actively managed for timber harvest. The effects of timber, the logging, are all through the landscape out here. But they've done it in a way that hasn't altered the water, the hydrology, the wetlands, and they've actually really improved the timber stands in the last 100 years as well. So it's actually an example of how you can do it right. You get sustainable timber production off your land without damaging the resources. And the testimony is all the high quality trout streams in this area and the high quality wetlands still functioning and doing their stuff. Really surprised me. The second surprise I had going up there was finding that when you go into the wetlands in this area, it's hard to find a non-native plant. In other words, there's no weeds up in these wetlands. How can that be? You go just down the hill, and there's canary grass, there's all the bad stuff that we see, but up in this area, it's all native plant communities. What that tells me is two things. Number one, the water, the hydrology is still working right. This place is acting like it did historically. Number two, you haven't had the disturbance. They haven't been running equipment through these wetlands either. So they've taken care of this place. The way to get weeds infesting coming into your wetlands is to either change the way the water works, because all these plants evolved since the glacial times to the water conditions in their location. If you remove that or change the way the water flows, then you give the edge to the non-native plants. Native plant communities will outcompete non-native plants if the water is working right. And you go out here, it's almost all native plants. Sorry, you look at this picture, there's not an alien species in it. except I think that's a UFO. Either that or mud on the lens. Pretty sure it's a UFO. Other than that, it's the only aliens you'll find up there. These kind of wetlands then really enhance the trout habitat. So here's a picture of Bulgus Creek, high quality trout stream. And so I walked up at this location. There's a really beautiful wet meadow on either side of the channel. I thought, oh good, I'm going to go out and take a picture of that channel with a wetland on either side. It was in July. I had my hip boots on. It was about 2 foot of water to get out to the channel itself. Even the wetland was full of water. And I got to the channel here, and I thought, oh good, I'll stand in the channel and take my picture. Took one step and whoosh, went right up. I'm an old duck hunter, so the camera stayed dry, but I got wet. And that really got me excited. Well, why did that get me excited? Because look, here we have, look at how narrow this channel is. This is an upper watershed trout stream channel that's narrow and deep. That's the form you want in this area for healthy trout streams. If you didn't have wetlands doing their thing in this part of the watershed, you couldn't have a deep, narrow channel like this. It would be 10 foot wide, 3 foot deep, and not providing much habitat for trout. Trout are living right in this stuff. Good, cool, clear, clean water, thanks to the wetlands, doing their thing, slowing that flow, capturing that spring precipitation, releasing it in a regulated manner. If a channel like this was out in the Pacific Northwest where I worked in salmon country, people would be coming from miles to see this because we've screwed up these places. We've messed these places up throughout the nation with wetland removal and alterations of our watershed. So when you see a watershed across the board in the conditions that this is in, that's a special thing. That's a special place, especially considering how much work's going on up there. All right, we can't talk about the Penokee Hills wetlands without talking about these guys. Very, very important to the health of the whole Bad River watershed. Beavers are critical to the watershed health. Now here's a picture at the very, very top of a creek called Bulgus Creek. That last creek where I went up to my neck, that's this same creek. This is at the very terminal top end of Bulgus Creek. This here is the top of Penokee Ridge. This is where the hole would be. So we're right at the base of where they want to dig the hole. This photo I took standing on top of about a 12-foot tall beaver dam. And the dam goes right like this. I'm standing at it taking the picture. High quality trout in that creek, and you stand there and you've got this water, and the thing to remember, a couple of things, is that there's springs feeding into this wetland, and beavers are holding it back, and a lot of people think, isn't that then warm up your water? Doesn't the beaver warm the water up? Well, beaver dams are pretty deep, and the other thing to remember is when you have a beaver dam like this, just like any other wetland, about 2/3 of the water is in the soil all around it. If you did groundwater testing all through, coming off this wetland, you'd find high elevated water levels in here, and that stuff's floating down. And it's evidenced by standing on top of the dam. So when you stand there and you know the water's flowing down Bulgus Creek, you stand on that dam and there's no water flowing over the dam. Well, how is Bulgus Creek getting its water? You go to the base of the dam and the water is bubbling up from the ground. It's absolutely amazing. All the base of this dam has got water bubbling up, that cool, deep water coming out, feeding down into Bulgus Creek. It's absolutely gorgeous. So you got small beaver dams. Beavers do their thing according to the landscape. You'll find some of them, this is about a 4-inch tall beaver dam. Here's one about 1.5 feet, holding water back in an alder wetland. This one's about 15 foot tall. This is a couple of our staff, our policy staff, Aaron O'Brien and Kyle Meguera. And they're not even at the bottom, they're not even standing on the bottom of that dam there. This is a different dam than the picture I showed you earlier. What's behind this dam? Ooh, that thing. It's about a 40-acre wetland. There are trumpeter swans nesting out in this wetland. This is right flat smack dab in the middle of where they want to put that 500-foot pile of rock. This would all be covered with waste rock if the plan went according to what they say they want to do. This summer, we went out there, and I only try and sneak in here occasionally because I don't want to disturb the swans. Unbelievably, the pair of swans on this wetland this summer raised 6 young. That is absolutely unheard of. And I haven't put it in yet, but I got a picture of it, of the swans near fledging that I haven't incorporated into this talk yet. But really, really important habitat. Here's what it looks like from the air. This is flying over that wetland. The big dam is right here, and there's a whole series of dam going down. I like to show this picture because people look at this and say, okay, yeah, there's a big wetland right there. This is the big area, part of the area where they want to dump all the rock. Well, it doesn't look like there's hardly any wetlands up there, just that one big one with the swans on it. Who cares? Well, you walk this area here, and this whole place is full of wetlands, absolutely soaking wet with all kinds of ephemeral wetlands, riparian wetlands, all the types of wetlands that we've been talking about, cedar swamps, black ash swamps. You can't see them from the air. So we think that a lot of when they first proposed this project, they looked at this area and they said, well, there's not too many wetlands up there. Well, there is. You got to get out and put your boots on and walk around. We think it may be as much as a 50% wetland landscape. 50% of the landscape may be in wetlands in this area, even though you can't see it. The other thing beavers do is capture sediment. Very, very important for that. So this is at the top end of this is where they want to dig the hole, of course. This is the top of the Penokee Ridge. This is that wetland that we showed you at first, where I took the picture standing on the dam right here. That flows down. This is Bull Gus Creek. This is a tributary to Bull Gus Creek. I like to show this because this wetland here illustrates the effects of beavers. Now, why do beavers build dams? A lot of the reason they build dams is because they live in lodges. They need to have some depth of water to survive, because they come into their lodge from below and they store all their food in water during the winter, so they got to have some depth. And if it's just this shallow, a beaver can't survive there. So they build a dam to hold water back to meet their needs, okay? Well, naturally then, in a situation like this, when a beaver builds its dam, there's still just natural runoff and natural sedimentation processes, and slowly over the decades or even centuries then, sediment enters these beaver dams and they get shallower and shallower and shallower. The beavers do their best to keep them deep, but they can't forever. And this is a good indication of that. There's 4 beaver dams right here. First one is right here. So they started out, put their dam here, and they were, fat and happy for a while. Over the decades or hundreds of years, that filled up, turned into a sedge meadow. It got too shallow for the beavers. What'd they do? They moved their second dam right here. That thing eventually filled up. Then they moved it back down here. That started getting shallow. Now their dam is down here, and they're doing their thing. So what the net effect of that is, think of all the sediment that those beavers are keeping up at the top of the watershed that otherwise would go flushing down into our trout streams, into other areas. And they're dynamic. They move around. They move their activity around in different parts of the watershed as they start to fill up. And here's a picture of it. So here's a beaver dam wetland that's starting to get shallow. You can see these sedges moving into this area. This is just about getting to the point where the beavers are probably going to say, maybe we need to go somewhere else. It's getting a little shallow for us here. So that's a real important function that the beavers provide. So let's go downstream a little bit. Remember we showed you that the Bad River Reservation, all the water in the Bad River Watershed ultimately flows onto the Bad River Reservation. Bad River Reservation, Anishinaabe tribe, they've got their own natural resources program, a very high quality natural resources program. So what they're doing is working a lot to protect and restore the water resources of the reservation. So of course they're very concerned what's happening with the quality of the water that's coming onto our lands. So what they did, starting about 12, 13, 14 years ago, is they started to develop their own water code, their own water quality standards. And they've been working on it for quite a while. In 2012, they completed it, and they submitted those regulations, their code, to the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA then has blessed their water code. And why that's important is any water that's flowing down the Bad River or any tributary onto the Bad River Reservation, when it crosses that jurisdictional boundary line, it has to meet the quality standards of the Bad River tribe. And if it doesn't, the federal government has to help them enforce that. So really important. And they've got some provisions in their water code that are very protective of the wild rice. We'll talk about wild rice here. All this water then, we saw the watershed, it starts at 1,800 foot, goes down to Lake Superior, 1,200 foot drop, fairly steep drop. It all ends up at this place called the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs. It's the largest freshwater estuary on Lake Superior. 16,000 acres, all on the Bad River Reservation. All this green in here, it's wild rice. Incredibly diverse and important wetland area. All the water that's coming off of this project ultimately ends up down here. A review on the map here. So remember, here's the project site. This is the ore body here. They want to dig the hole here, and then this is where they want to dump all the waste rock in the upper watershed. And all those waters then flow down onto the res. This is the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs right here. And that's where the ground flattens out. So you have steep water, sediment drops out where the things get flat. Remember that. So that's all a really big flat area.
I've heard this river body is like 22 miles long. Is this just what they're proposing now, to take
This
5
is-
miles? And then
Right,
extend?
all they've said is we want to do 4.5, but yeah, they've mentioned that there's 22 miles of ore body potentially, but they didn't want to propose that all at once. So the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs have been recognized as very important. Our organization back in 2009 declared this one of our 100 wetland gems. We identified some of the highest quality wetlands around the state. They're not the highest quality, but there are 100 good examples of high quality wetlands throughout the state. And of course, the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs wetlands became a wetland gem right away. This is a couple of tribal staff out on the sloughs with us. The other important thing that happened in 2012, the area was designated by the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. Anybody know what Ramsar is? Anybody ever heard of that? Yeah, very few people have heard of it, even resource people. It's a convention of 160 countries come together every couple of years in a different location around the world and do a lot of things, but one of the things they do is identify what they call globally important wetlands, internationally important wetlands, the most important wetlands around the world, and they designate these things wetlands of international importance. The Kakagon Bad River Sloughs got designated a wetland of international importance by the Ramsar Convention in 2012. There's only 3 of them in the state of Wisconsin. What do you think? Oregon, Upper Mississippi wetland complexes, and the Kakagon Bad River Sloughs. Now you think of Oregon and you think of the Upper Mississippi River wetlands, both of those wetland areas are very, very altered, very different than they were historically. They're still really high quality, but they're not the same. This is the only one of its size anywhere around here that is still untouched. There's no drainage in here, there's no dikes, there's been no alteration of how the water works like you've had in other parts of this area. We had the honor to present the plaque for the award to the Bad River Tribe. That's the chairman, Mike Wiggins Jr., a couple years ago, so that was really a good honor for us, for our organization. Okay, well, we said there's a lot of wild rice out in those Bad River Sloughs, isn't there? It's the cultural foundation of the Bad River people. When the Bad River, several hundred years ago, moved west from the eastern part of the United States, and the stories that they tell was that they were told to move east, to migrate, and they would know when they reached their destination when they found the food that grew on the water. And they say, well, we didn't know what that was. Nobody knew what that meant. What is the food that grows on the water? And they finally got out to hear the Kakagon Sloughs. They said, wow, guess what? This is home. This is what the legends have told us. This is the food that grows on the water. So very important. Now, wild rice is an annual grass. It's a wetland grass. It grows from seed every year, okay? And this is a little bit of an illustration. Here's the mud. This is the water level. And it's a little different than some of the other grasses. It's just a grain about this big. Everybody's eating wild rice. You know what it looks like. It grows up in the spring, and instead of just growing straight out of the water like a lot of grasses, it grows up, hits the surface, and there's a period of time where the leaves are floating on the surface of the water before it can grow enough to lift that thing up and grow tall like you know the rice to be. This is what it looks like. So this is like usually in June when you have the rice in this condition floating on the water. And this is a very vulnerable time of the year for wild rice. Now remember, it's an annual plant, so it doesn't have a lot of roots holding it into the mud. And especially at this stage, it hasn't grown its mature roots even for the summer yet. So at this stage, it's very vulnerable, especially to water level rise. So if you lift this water where the rice is a foot or two all at once, or in a short period of time, you can pull all those plants out from the roots. You can lose your whole rice crop in one flood event when it's in this condition. Remember that hydrograph we showed, the graph where it showed the peaks and how wetlands smooth out that so it doesn't peak so high? Without the wetlands, a big concern we have is that will you increase the flashiness of this waterway? Will you bring conditions that could raise the water levels during this time of year and hurt your rice? That is a big concern of ours. Rice also needs sediment. Estuaries are built by sediment. You think of New Orleans, you think about that area here, it's the same type of estuary, it's just on fresh water. Estuaries, that big 16,000 acre wetland area is built because that's the flat part of the watershed. That's where the sediment over the thousands of years since the glacier settled out and created these incredibly broad, flat, diverse areas. So the wild rice then is adapted to live in a sediment environment. They only grow in flowing waters. So what they do, it's really interesting, the way the form is, and I learned this from some of the wild rice experts up in the area, the plant grows up out of the mud and it's adapted to kind of capture sediment and drop it right around the base of it to take the nutrients out of that new sediment. That's what helps its growth early on. So you need sediment coming into your estuary, but if you have too much sediment, you'll cause problems. If you have not enough sediment, you'll cause problems. So they call it the Goldilocks effect. You need to have just the right amount. You have to have a good balance of sediment to have healthy wild rice. Remember what we talked about with the wetlands? The wetlands hold the sediment back. Beaver dams hold the sediment back. If you lose all those wetlands in your upper watershed and you change the nature of all those channels, you scour them out, where's all that sediment going to go? It's all going to end up down here. And they're already concerned about that. Here's a study that the tribe's been doing. They've been losing some of their rice beds already because there's some agricultural development in the Bad River Watershed and some of the tributaries flow with high sediment loads. And some of these rice beds now are starting to be taken over by other wetland plants because they're getting shallower. They're acting more like a marsh than they are a wild rice flowing waterway. So this is a big concern. And so the question is, if we've already got this happening, what happens if we lose more of the wetlands in the upper watershed? We're going to be flushing more sediment down this area. The scientists up there are worried that could this be the straw that breaks the camel's back? It needs to be studied. We need to understand that. So very, very high concerns. From our standpoint, this is one of the most unique wetlands, certainly in the Midwest, and worthy of protection no matter what happens. We have got to protect these sloughs. And so it's not a question of, well, can we do this project and not hurt the sloughs? Prove it to me. Prove to me that you can do that work and not affect these things. It's not a likelihood. If the project goes in and we were wrong, oops, I guess we didn't realize it killed the rice. It's too late. There's nothing you can do. You can't put a project like this back. Take that rock and dump it back in. So it's really important that we get it right, that we do the science, that we understand the implications. What we've been doing in our organization is getting out all over the state, letting people understand what's up there and what the implications are if you remove those upper watershed wetlands. And this is just a subset of some of the impacts, potential impacts. This is just the hydrology and the sediment. There's a lot of other people that have expertise in other portions of this project. Our expertise is the wetlands, the water, and the sediment balance. So what's next? So we're really working hard to make sure that the science is getting done right. And in a watershed like the Bad River, because it's never been threatened, no one's really paid attention to it. So we first come up there, I said, show me the hydrographs. Well, hydrographs? We didn't have hydrographs. Nobody's done hardly any studies up here. So there's a Bad River Watershed Association now, they're doing a lot of work. There's all these people now coming together, trying to understand, what do we got up here? And so that's all going on right now. We're proposing a framework. Let's get the baseline information so we know what's up there before you even start talking about any kind of planning or anything else. And then what are the groundwater, surface water? This is an unbelievably complex, not only from a wetland standpoint, a landscape standpoint, but also geologically complex. So there's a lot of stuff going on here that we don't understand yet. So all that stuff's gotta be studied before you can start talking about anything, because then you gotta know what your impact is. What can you do? Spread the word. Let people know, get to know, spread the word about what's up here. Educate yourself. I go around all over the state and people say, yeah, I kinda heard about this thing up north, I didn't really know much about it. So talk to people, spread the word. I'm giving this talk in any community that'll invite me, so if you know of anybody that wants to hear this talk, have them call me, and we're running all over the state. Support the folks that are working in these issues and get involved that way and get up there. We do a couple of tours a year, open to the public, Natural Resources Foundation, and during the Chequamegon Bird Festival in May, I'll be giving a tour then as well. So get up there and get to know this place. And that's it. I want to thank all the photographers and a lot of the funding helping pay for our travels up there is by Patagonia, the Magnificent Mile store in Chicago. So if you're ever down in Chicago, stop into the Patagonia store on Magnificent Mile and tell them we sent you. Buy something there, because I certainly want it. It's really expensive in the store. Well, thank you so much. I'm open to any questions.
Is the EPA involved in this?
We're trying to get them involved, yes.
They're not involved yet?
The feds are not as well involved yet because there hasn't been a proposal. So the way things have worked is the company came in and they said, we want to do this project, but we don't like the state laws. The state laws are too restrictive. So if we can fix these laws, maybe we'll want to go in. And so they wrote a new mining law a couple of years ago that didn't pass. It failed by, what, 1 or 2 votes? Scott, you remember 2 votes, 1 vote, something like that. Very close. And the company said, you know what, I think we're out of here. We can't mine in these very hard restrictions environmental restrictions that Wisconsin has. So an election came, things changed. First bill off the last session to come out was a new iron mine bill, and it passed this time because they had the votes. So the company said, great, that works for us. We're gonna start this project. They made this proposal. That kicked in some of the state work, but the feds don't get in that early on. They've been involved in some of the bulk sampling and some of the issues going on in that, but not in terms of the big project yet. They do come, they have been interacting with the scientists and people that are doing some of the work. The U.S. Geological Survey is doing some of the groundwater, surface water work. There's a lot of stuff going on that the feds are involved in, but from a regulatory standpoint, it hasn't kicked in yet because there isn't really anything proposed. And so the EPA has the ability to come in and do some what we call cumulative effects analysis in this area or even in this whole part of Lake Superior. And a lot of the tribes and a lot of the folks now are trying to encourage the Environmental Protection Agency to come up here, even though there's no proposal, say, look, we've got to not be reactive on this, but we've got to get ahead of the game. And look what we've got up here, and whether there's a mine proposal or not, those are activities that need to happen in this area. So that's the state of that right now. The interesting thing is, the state law changed the way we do mining regulations so much that the federal government, even during the testimony of the bill, came in and said, you know what, if you guys pass this law, this changes your process so much that we can't go with you in the review. In the past, the state and the federal process has always converged, and the environmental review on projects was very efficient. They said this changes things too much. So now, because of this new law, you'll have a state process environmental review and permit, and a federal process that are two very different, with different requirements, different set of information that to be looking at, and probably two very different decisions coming out of it. So it's ironic that they came in and changed this law so much. It might have made it more difficult for them because of that. If they'd have just made it mediocre and the Fed said, no, we don't like it, but we'll go with you, it would be a different story. But we got two processes now.
Are they gonna be working at a federal level now that they've got control of the Senate and the Congress to change those minds, or whatever?
Keep an eye on it, yes, that's very important. That's one way folks can get involved, is really keep an eye on the federal process right now. That's a big fear. A lot of us, we're looking, well, the Corps of Engineers, the Fed's gotta permit this thing too, and we're thinking, boy, we're relying on the Feds, and a little nervous about that. But that was a big part of our work early on. The federal government has jurisdiction over navigable waters, okay, under the Clean Water Act. So I think part of the reason this area was proposed, when they looked at that area where they wanted to put the rocks, and they said this early on in some of their articles they put out in the newspaper and whatnot. They said, well, is there wetlands up there? Well, no, there's not a whole lot of wetlands, just a bunch of puddles. So in other words, they didn't recognize what was up there. So a big part of our work then, especially early on the first year, was we got to get up there and make sure that the wetlands are up there, are connected to navigable waters, and are of the type that brings in federal jurisdiction. And all this stuff with the channels and the groundwater, all this kind of stuff, was the thoughts we were putting together early on to make sure that we could make that argument. And in our testimony, we did. And the federal government, now the Corps of Engineers said, yeah, of course, we have jurisdiction over this whole area. It's all connected to navigable waters. So that's the good news, at least that, unless they change the federal law. But at this point, there is still some regulation, strong regulation from that standpoint.
So have you documented the drainage up there, where it drains to?
Right.
The navigable waterway?
Yep. So a lot of folks are doing that
there are
now.
no isolated wetland systems, no
Yep.
perched wetland systems, or that don't
And
have
it's a
direct
complicated
connection?
area, so there's groundwater stuff going on all over. This could take several years to document it really well, but you look at it from the standpoint and the flow and everything, and it's enough right now, even without a lot of intensive studies, for the federal government to say, yeah, these things are all connected.
Has the federal government looked at the report that they submitted for the they haven't applied for a permit, but
It's just a
They-
pre-project proposal.
Yeah,
The Feds,
but
I'm
they
sure
have-
they've looked at it, but they haven't, they say, well, what's this? This isn't anything we react to. And the company then, this year, in 2014, started their environmental process, so they got a reputable company up there to look at the wetlands. And early on, they said, yeah, we're gonna do all the environmental review in one season, it's a piece of cake, and we're gonna have our project proposal to the state in the fall of 2014. Well, they got out there, and we were up there a lot, looking at the flagging and stuff where things had been marked, and you can see they only worked in a couple areas, they had a lot of flags. I think the company must have sat them down and said, guys, do you know what's up here? Do you understand how extensive the wetland resources are on this site? We can't do this in 1 year. And so they pulled everybody out in August, said, and they went in the paper saying, you know what, the leaves are starting to turn, it's too late to do wetland work. Well, you can do wetland work till the end of October. So we're hoping that's an indication that maybe, maybe they're realizing this is gonna be a little more difficult than they originally thought. And the reason they thought there wasn't many wetlands up there, when you look at the wetland maps that the state puts out, they call wetland inventory maps, it doesn't show a lot of wetlands up there, just a bunch of dots. And in those heavily forested areas, those maps are made with aerial photo interpretation. You don't see the wetlands in those forested sites. It underrepresents the wetland landscape, very much so. And all us wetland scientists know that, but whoever was looking at those maps on the internet didn't realize that, and they thought, oh, this is an area here with hardly any wetlands. So we had to get up there and make sure, yeah, there's wetlands up there and they're connected. And that was a big part of our early work.
Once they dig their hole, is it just gonna fill up with water?
Nobody knows. There's absolutely, the groundwater surface water studies are just starting right now. The USGS spent a year trying to figure out how the groundwater is moving off of that hill. And what they're finding is it's glacial. Some of the water they're pulling up out of the wells on the reservation at the bottom of the watershed, 5,000 years old. So you've got this stuff moving down very slowly. It's really complex. You got iron, you got alluvium, you got a really, really interesting place there. And that's our point. You've got to understand what's there before anybody talks about any kind of project implications.
Can you,
Oh,
You
sorry.
mentioned trout quite a bit in your talk.
Yeah.
Is trout are limited inside the state at all involved with partners?
So I've been wandering around those wetlands up there for a couple of years, and my partner, the guy that's been with me the most, is a guy named Bill Hart. And we've been lost in those hills many, many times. And yeah, he's the Northwest representative for TU, so yeah, they're really involved. And, yeah,
I believe the gallery has a question.
yeah,
yes.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the treaty rights and how this affects
Yeah.
that. because
So
there
there's
are
kind of
treaty
three
rights
things going
carried
on
through
right
the
now.
water.
Yeah, there's kind of three things going from that angle. You've got the state law, that, the new mining law, and how that review and permit process goes. You got the federal under the Clean Water Act, all that business. Then you've got the third leg of this whole thing is the tribal treaty rights issue. Now, treaties are the highest law of the land. When the United States enters a treaty, that trumps everything else. So very, very important. The Bad River tribe in their treaty, there was a series of treaties, but ultimately what they did was reserve several things. The treaty recognized that this whole area was their land, was their territory, and the treaty then said, all right, we'll agree to reserve this area just for you if you'll let us bring settlers in to all these other areas. Okay, great, but we want to retain certain rights. We're going to retain hunting, gathering, fishing rights in this area that we're letting the settlers go. And on the res, we're keeping all our rights, because that's our land now. That's the reservation, they reserved the rights there. And so, you have a bunch of issues then involved with the treaties. If this project then if it can be shown that by putting this project in, you are going to diminish some of the reserved rights that were reserved by that treaty, then federal government has to step in and say, wait, we can't do that, we can't allow that because that goes against this high law. And I worked for a tribe for 22 years out west, a lot of these types of issues. And when you can have strong treaty rights like they have here, and use good science to connect the rights with the science, with the implications of the activity, that's incredibly strong in a court of law. Ultimately, if this whole thing goes ahead and ends up getting permitted, that's where it'll all end up, in a treaty rights case in a court of law.
What kind of a court?
Hopefully federal court, you would think.
I just
But
think
that's
a
years
way
down
that
the road,
people don't
if it gets to that point, hopefully it never gets to that
It would end up in our state Supreme Court, hopefully.
No, because the treaty rights are federally reserved rights.
So it could end up in the US Supreme Court,
Right, good.
which is much better.
And I've worked a lot of these cases when you can very clearly, with science, with good data, say, if you do this, then this is gonna happen from a treaty rights standpoint. The courts look at that incredibly well.
I saw that the Congress had passed a law that limited the science for the EPA, input into the EPA, and they were going to change some of their regulations, loosening. I don't know if somebody wants to look that up,
Yeah,
but that's what I heard today.
I mean, we always gotta be vigilant on that stuff.
Duffy proposed legislation to facilitate this.
Yes. Facilitate what, putting it in?
Yeah, I don't know, you're right, I don't know what specifically, but he proposed legislation to water down the standards,
Federal standards.
the federal standards. right?
Keep an eye on that stuff. That's one way you can be involved. Yes.
How do you help the people who are living up there understand how the science that you're doing is relevant to their lives?
You're talking about the people that want the mine?
No, well, yeah,
Ashland County.
the whole Ashland.
I've given this talk all over the hills there, and a lot of participation. So the people up there are really involved, really interested, really active, and they know this ground very well. We've done a lot of tours up there as well, and really getting the word out, and helping people interpret it, what they see. So when you go up into these areas, you see these wetlands, giving them the ability to see the functions, how this is helping regulate the water and whatnot. And so, it's been great, but the tragedy of things like this is oftentimes it really splits communities apart. Because people, these people want jobs, well, everybody wants jobs, but they want it, and there's families fighting, it's really hard.
So this is a follow-up question to that one. Are you noticing any attitude shift in the last couple of years that you've been putting this information out in that community that's most affected?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, you got two different counties on this, Ashland County and Iron County. And just thinking about the boards of each county, Ashland County originally had some folks that were really in favor of this. This is great. But once they started seeing it and what the implications were, they took a U-turn. And some of the board members on the Iron, most of their pro yet, but we always say the longer this drags out, there's more people jumping off the mine bandwagon than on. So that's why we want this out here. We want the discussion on this to be based in facts and not a bunch of rhetoric. And when people get polarized like that, they're not always talking facts. We want the science is the science. Lay it on the table. Everybody looks at the same science, and we talk about what are the implications, what's acceptable, what's not. That's what we're advocating for.
How did you end up getting involved? Were you working for one of the counties, for the state, for the tribes? So if your group hadn't been involved, how much of the science would have been?
Well, there'd still be a lot of science going on, because there's a lot of people involved. We're just helping with the wetland part of this. We originally got involved, I guess it was late 2012, yeah. The Anishinaabe tribes asked me to come up and present just our organization's information at one of their Voight Council meetings. So I gave up and gave a talk, and of course the whole discussion that was just before the first mining bill was hitting the ground, and all they wanted to talk about was the mine. And Mike Wiggins Jr. asked me if we would get involved, and I promised him at that meeting that we would, not knowing what I was getting myself into. So, here we are. Scott.
Tracy, you've grown close to tribal members and leadership over the last couple of years. Can you give us any sense of how determined they are to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, and if you all know Scott, he's a former board member of our organization, Wetlands. This, the tribe calls this genocide. That's the word they use for this project. And this is going to be cultural and true genocide for our people, because they look at the threat and what will happen potentially to their rice. Their rice is their cultural foundation. And it's just like I worked out west with the salmon tribes, the same thing. You lose the salmon, the tribes out there say, we die. And that's what they're saying here about the rice. You lose this rice, we don't survive. And so they're taking it very seriously. There are people saying, quite a few saying, this mine will not go in my lifetime. What do they mean by that? Pretty obvious. So they're taking this incredibly, incredibly serious. And hopefully we can get the science and show this stuff and get beyond this before it goes even to the courts and some of those things. So, there's a lot at stake.
What is the projected lifetime of this project, and how many people do they think they would employ?
It's a good question. The pre-project proposal, I always tell people it's not even a conceptual plan. It's less than a conceptual plan. A lot of the things in the pre-project proposal don't even make sense. And since they put that out, they've gone out in the newspaper willy-nilly changing some of the things they said they wanted to do originally. The other day, a couple months ago, they said, well, I guess we're not gonna dig our pit in Ashland County, because we don't like Ashland County anymore. Well, that's like a fourth of their pit, just out of the blue. How does that work? They said they're moving the locations of some of the infrastructure. Well, we were gonna put all our processing facilities on the north side, but now we're moving on the south side. Really, really strange. So it's been hard to really pinpoint what's really going on in regard to this. They've done some bulk sampling, which is important when you're thinking about doing a project like this. They originally had, I think, 8 bulk sampling sites they were gonna test. and some of them got controversial, so they said, all right, we're only gonna do 5. I mean, just like that. And then they didn't like the way they were gonna dig, they didn't want them blasting because of the grunite. You probably heard about the asbestos rocks, which is a whole nother subject that I don't talk about, because that's not my expertise. But, so they said, all right, we won't blast, we'll just take the surface rock out of these bulk sites. Well, that doesn't make any sense either, because that's contaminated. And so there's just a lot of things going on up there that gives the indication that, are these guys really serious? They're talking about $1.5 billion project, but they've had a small staff doing some just very little work up there. They haven't spent a lot of money on this, a few $1 million up there. There's a lot of speculation what's really going on, and I don't know, I'm not gonna get into that. But some of the things they said early on was that, oh, this will be a 700 jobs. You probably all heard that quote. It'll go on for 30 years, and then it'll be done, and that type of thing. And a lot of the folks have been talking, well, that's the nature of mining, it's a boom bust kind of deal. So the good news of this, this kind of project is it's got a lot of the local people really talking about sustainable economic development. What can we do to really bring in jobs and in a sustainable manner? So it's really bringing a lot of that discussion, a lot of people working that way. So that'll make the argument less important. If, there's high unemployment rate in Iron County, but you know how many people? What's the population of Iron County? Any ideas? 6,000. So 13% unemployment in Iron County. You can count heads on that. So that's the scale. It's not like 13% unemployment in Milwaukee. So I think the solutions to get those people jobs are certainly doable.
So what's your prediction?
I think this is, I think there's so many problems that this, yeah.
Think it's finally gonna go away?
To be honest with you, I don't think, I don't think this
You're right.
Well, I always say that the good news that could come out of this, right now, it's Iron County land, Iron County has a stockpile. I didn't tell you, the top, where they wanna dig the pit, that's privately owned by a couple of iron companies, not the company proposing the project. Gogeeba Taconite is the company that's proposing the project. They don't own any land up there. They've got agreements with a couple of so it's private land on the top of the ridge where the pit would be dug. And, what we're hoping is this scary enough that finally that land will be bought out, someone will make an offer, and this whole area will get protected. That's, I'm hoping, is the silver lining on this whole thing, because this place needs to be protected.
And it is pretty low-grade ore, it's taconite 23 or 25%, something like that.
They tell me, and I'm not an expert on this, but a lot of the good stuff has been taken out with shaft mining over the years. And it's interesting, the tribe did a bat survey a couple years ago, and they thought, hey, let's go into these old shafts and see what kind of bat use we're getting in these old shafts. So they went, and they're all full of water. Tells you something's going on in the groundwater there, kids, Dig a big hole, is that what's gonna happen? And then if they dig a hole, if it fills up with water, what do you do with all that water? I mean, there's all these unknowns, so many unknowns on projects.
So they've previously been mining in the area that proposed to be in the bush?
Well, there's been mining there for many, many decades. Not since, I think, the 60s or 70s, but that whole area's been shaft mining. That's why Iron County, it's their tradition. We're miners, this is what we do. And it's true, they did a lot of shaft mining up there. That whole area, this area's been mined.
Do they have
It's
any
been
idea
logged.
of like what percent of the volume that they've already taken out?
I don't know those figures.
Where they're going to dump all this, what's the soil like? How thick is it before you hit bedrock?
It's variable. It's an extremely diverse landscape. The surface formations of the landscape is diverse, and then the bedrock alluvium is diverse as well. There's some areas that we know are at least 60-foot bedrock, and some areas where the bedrock's right at the surface and everything in between. There's peat in a lot of areas, but no, a lot of those wetlands don't have peat in it. Some of the meadows and things like that, especially the ones associated with the trout streams, Yeah. So, it's a really diverse area, really surprised that that's the diversity, the abundance, and the quality of the wetlands in this area. And it makes sense when you think about it.
I think in the questions people had about the mining and how that's gone on, I think it's important, as far as I understand it, that, you know, the open pit mining is a much more mechanized procedure. I mean, it's mechanized mining, and it's not, from what I understand, you bring in people from the outside. These aren't local people that are, you know, gonna have the local jobs, and I think that's one thing that, a lot of people up there just, you know, don't quite get, that it's not the type of mining that's been done in the past. It's a huge open pit
It's
mine.
a lot of those things where we see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. We want to hold on to something.
Right.
We're impoverished, we have problems, this is 700 jobs. I'm gonna grab onto it, I'm gonna hold on to that as tight as I can. Come hell or high water, and that's, I think, what's happening with people.
Right, and the reality of what those jobs are.
I wanna trust these people, I wanna trust this company because I wanna believe it. There's a psychology